They say the snow in Aspen reflects the light of winners, but that afternoon, that same light was about to expose another truth, that even those who stand at the peak of success can be diminished by the prejudice of another's gaze. On the frost-covered runway, Julian Mercer, 43, founder and CEO of Nexora Analytics, stood tall against the cutting air. He wore no heavy coat, just a perfectly tailored charcoal vest, his breath turning to mist in the thin mountain air. Behind him, the Gulfstream G650 gleamed in the amber sunlight, a symbol of class, speed, and power he had built with his own hands. The deal he had just closed at a nearby resort was the kind that sent shockwaves through the tech world. Nexora had signed a partnership with the largest telecommunications corporation in North America, paving the way for a global AI behavioral prediction platform. Investors were already calling it the deal that will define the next decade. But for Julian, it was only another step in a vision much larger, one he had been crafting since the days he coded out of a cramped garage in Oakland. His assistant, Sienna Park, 35, stood beside him with a tablet in hand. The wind loosened a few strands of hair from her tidy bun, but she didn't seem to notice. "We're cleared for takeoff in 15 minutes, Mr. Mercer. Slot confirmed with air traffic control," she said crisply, her voice clear and efficient. Julian nodded with a faint smile. "Excellent, Sienna. By tonight, New York will be alive again." His words were light, but his eyes carried the unmistakable resolve of a man who refused to accept limits. He wasn't born into privilege. His mother had been a nurse, his father a factory mechanic. He knew what it meant to be underestimated, and he had turned the world's doubt into fuel for an empire. The sound of engines grew louder in the distance. Two pilots emerged from the cockpit, preparing for boarding. The one in front was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, silver hair cropped close, his eyes cold and sharp as steel. The name stitched on his uniform read, Captain Harold Knox. "Good afternoon, Captain," Julian greeted, extending his hand. "Looking forward to a smooth flight." Knox returned the handshake briefly, cold, firm, impersonal. "We'll do our best, sir, Mercer. Is it?" The question wasn't meant to confirm, but to appraise. His eyes flicked down to Julian's Patek Philippe watch, then back to his face, narrowing slightly. Sienna hesitated for a fraction of a second. She had seen that look many times before, the look that refused to believe a brown-skinned man, dressed simply, could be the one chartering a G650. Julian noticed, but said nothing. He simply smiled, calm and unbothered, and began to ascend the steps. Inside, amber light poured through the cabin windows, glinting off walnut panels and Italian leather. To him, this flight was merely a pause between missions, unaware that this very plane, the one he had chartered, was about to become a battlefield for dignity. At the top of the stairway, Captain Knox watched his every step, lips pressed tight, eyes narrowing. Inside him, something stirred, not respect, but instinctive bias. And in that split second, he had already made his judgment. That man, no matter how fine his suit, did not belong to this world. On the white runway below, snow began to fall softly. Julian settled into the leather seat, opened his laptop, and began drafting his final report for the board. He had no idea that the smooth flight he had just wished for himself would never take off. The hum of the auxiliary engine whined softly outside, like a heartbeat accelerating before a storm. Inside the cabin, everything was pristine to the point of sterility. The beige leather gleamed. The scent of walnut wood mingled with the faint trace of expensive cologne. And yet, amid all that perfection, something felt out of place. An invisible tension hung in the air, stretched thin like a violin string ready to snap. Julian leaned forward, reviewing data on his screen. Across from him, Sienna had just sent the final summary email of the signed deal to the legal team in New York. She glanced out the window and saw Captain Knox still standing at the bottom of the air stairs, talking into his headset, his face stiff and his gestures sharp, almost angry. "Do you think he seems off?" Sienna asked quietly, her tone cautious but alert. Julian looked up, peering through the glass. The sunlight reflected off the cockpit windshield, obscuring the captain's expression. But his body language was unmistakable, tense shoulders, locked jaw, every movement radiating control and suspicion. "Could be a technical issue," Julian replied evenly. "Or maybe he just wants to remind everyone who's in charge." He didn't know that this so-called authority would soon become a weapon. 5 minutes later, the cabin door opened, not with the usual crisp click, but with a drawn breath and a forceful knock, as if the person entering wanted everyone to hear it. Captain Knox appeared, tall and imposing, his grey eyes as cold as metal. "Mr. Mercer," he said, voice curt and heavy, "I need to see your identification and the charter confirmation." The words sliced through the air like a blade. Sienna froze for a heartbeat, then spoke quickly, her tone still polite, but her gaze sharp. "Excuse me, Captain. Everything has already been verified by ground operations and the sovereign system. I have the electronic confirmation right here." She held up her tablet, displaying the document. At the top of the screen, the line read clearly, "Julian Mercer, Principal Passenger, Nexora Analytics." Knox didn't glance at it. He kept his eyes fixed on Julian, long and cold, as if doubting his own sight. "I need to see your ID," he said. Julian furrowed his brow slightly but stayed silent. He took out his wallet and placed his driver's license on the table. Captain Knox picked it up, studied it closely, his lips pressed into a thin line. A short, dry sound. He checked the photo, then looked up, his expression unchanged. "You say you're the CEO of Nexora?" "That's right," Julian replied calmly, his voice low but steady. "If there's an issue, you can verify through the priority line." Knox gave a faint, dismissive smirk. "We have our own procedures, sir, and sometimes paperwork doesn't tell the whole story." A simple sentence, but beneath it lay an entire world of prejudice. Sienna's grip on her tablet tightened, her face flushing red. "This is the client who paid for the entire charter, Captain. You're insulting a sovereign air customer." Knox turned away coolly. "I'm ensuring flight safety. If there's any doubt, we delay the trip." Julian drew a slow breath, holding on to his composure. He had faced hostile shareholders and relentless media before, but he had never felt the sting of suspicion from someone paid to bring him home safely. In that instant, old memories came rushing back. Being stopped by security guards outside a boardroom and asked, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" The looks that slid past him to find the real boss. He knew exactly what this was, and he knew that if he let anger win, he'd lose. Julian rose to his full height, nearly eye level with Knox, his voice quiet but cutting like a blade. "Captain, you're not protecting safety. You're testing the limits of patience. But let me be clear. You just made your first mistake of the day, and it might be the biggest one of your career." The cabin fell dead silent. The auxiliary engine kept humming beneath them, a steady, muffled rhythm against the steel frame. Knox gave a thin smile, stepping back slightly, but in his eyes flickered a dangerous spark of defiance. Julian knew then this wasn't over. It had only just begun. The cabin door burst open a second time, harder and more deliberate. This was no longer a request, but a declaration of power. Captain Harold Knox filled the doorway, his shoulders broad, his jaw square, his eyes sharp as bullets forged from steel. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his voice cold and heavy, ringing like metal striking the floor. "I've reviewed the passenger manifest. There's a discrepancy in the primary client file. I can't authorize this flight to depart under these conditions. You both need to deplane immediately." Inside the cabin, the air froze solid. Sienna stared at him, eyes wide, her pulse hammering in her chest. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" "Deplane," Knox repeated curtly, his gaze unblinking. "Right now." Lila Hart, the flight attendant, stood motionless mid-cabin, still holding a tray of orange juice. Her professional smile disappeared. In 8 years on the job, she had never seen anything like this. A captain expelling a charter client. Sienna shot to her feet. "You have no right." Julian raised a hand, stopping her. "It's fine, Sienna," he said, his tone eerily calm. "Let me handle this." He turned to face Knox. "Captain, I chartered this flight, paid in full through the company account. The contract was signed, verified, and logged in Sovereign Air's system. You're jeopardizing your carrier's reputation over a discrepancy you can't even define." Knox crossed his arms, chin lifted slightly, the posture of a man convinced he held absolute authority. "This is a security matter. I don't need to explain further. My decision is final." Sienna stood silent, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles went white. She wanted to scream, but Julian gave a slight shake of his head. In his eyes there was no anger, only something colder, deeper, understanding. He looked at Knox for a long moment before speaking quietly. "You look at me, and you don't see a CEO. You see someone you've already decided doesn't belong on this plane. Isn't that right?" The question cut through the silence like lightning. Knox's jaw tightened. "I'm not discussing race here, Mr. Mercer. I'm talking about procedure." "Procedure?" Julian let out a quiet laugh. "What procedure states that the lead passenger must look the way you expect?" Knox didn't answer. His gaze shifted for a second, then returned, hardened. "Leave the aircraft, or I'll report to ground control that you're interfering with flight safety." Sienna snapped. "Interfering? You're abusing your authority." But Julian only gave her a calm, steady look. "Sienna, enough." He closed his laptop and slid it into his case, each motion deliberate, precise. Not because he was defeated, but because he was choosing when to strike. He rose to his full height, his face catching the cabin light, cold and sharp. "Captain Knox," he said, his voice low and controlled, every word deliberate. "I suggest you remember this moment, because it will mark the beginning of something you won't be able to stop." Knox gave a thin, mocking smile, arms folded. "Is that a threat?" "No," Julian replied, his gaze unwavering. "It's a prediction." He stepped forward, stopping half a foot from the captain. His breath was steady, cold. "I built my empire on data, Captain. I see patterns, I read behavior, and I predict outcomes. And I've just discovered a new data point. Your name." Knox's brow lifted, his mouth twisting into a half smile of disdain. "Good luck, Mercer. On the ground." He stepped aside, allowing Julian and Sienna to pass, while Lila Hart could only lower her eyes, ashamed and frightened. As they descended the stairs, the wind whipped snow against their faces. Julian drew in a long breath, not from the cold, but to steady the storm gathering inside him. He was not a man easily offended, but his silence was never weakness. It was the calm before something powerful. Inside the cabin, Knox slammed the door shut. The metallic click echoed like the sound of a gun chamber locking. Lila looked at him, her voice trembling. "Captain, are you sure?" "Quiet," Knox snapped. "I'm the authority here. No one questions me on my plane." The words rang through the cabin, sharp and metallic, but they were also his own sentence of doom. On the icy tarmac, Julian and Sienna walked side by side, their shadows long across the snow. Sienna muttered, "You're not just going to let this go, are you?" Julian's voice was low, steady as the winter wind. "No, Sienna. I'm just giving them a few hours to write their own indictment." The cabin door closed behind him, with a sharp, final click, the sound of patience ending. On the mist-covered runway, Julian Mercer stood tall, his eyes cold and still, almost frighteningly calm. Behind him, the Gulfstream G650 gleamed under the pale light, its reflection blurring across the snow whipped by the wind. He said nothing. He simply watched the aircraft he had chartered and been expelled from take off without him. Beside him, Sienna Park walked briskly, her anger still burning. "Unbelievable! They kicked us off our own flight. I'm calling the operator. We'll sue them." Julian remained silent, walking slowly toward the terminal, each step heavier than the last, weighed down not by the winter chill, but by the frost spreading from within. "No," he said finally. "We're not suing." Sienna stopped short. "Not suing? Julian, he insulted you. He insulted the entire company." "And that," Julian interrupted, his eyes glinting, "is why we'll do something far worse." In the private lounge, the golden light reflected off the glass, outlining his calm figure in the window, more like a man plotting his next move than a victim seeking justice. Sienna gripped her phone, tapping furiously, her voice shaking. "I called Sovereign's operations line. They transferred me to a customer experience manager. Can you believe that?" Julian didn't answer. His gaze was fixed outside, where the G650 was taxiing, its engines beginning to roar. In his eyes was no anger, only the cold calculation of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering storms. He took out his phone and opened his contacts. 2 names appeared. Maya Ellison, head of communications at Nexora, and Daniel Coe, chairman of the board. He called the first. "Maya, I need a press statement in 1 hour," he said, his voice calm, dangerously calm. On the other end, Maya's voice was steady. What should it say? Just the truth. No emotion, no accusation. But make sure the reader feels the chill in every word. He paused briefly, then added, "And include one line. Nexora is reviewing its multi-million-dollar corporate account with Sovereign Air Charter." There was a second of silence. Maya understood immediately. That line, sounding like simple procedure, was, in the corporate world, the coldest declaration of war. "Understood, Julian. It'll be live on PR Wire in 60 minutes. He ended the call, then dialed the second number. "Daniel," he said when the older man answered, "I need you to gather the shareholders. There's going to be a media storm. Not about us. About them." "What happened?" Daniel asked, his tone low and cautious. "Nothing serious," Julian replied evenly. "Just a pilot who thinks skin color decides who deserves a leather seat." There was a pause, followed by Daniel's sigh. "Do you want me to reach out to Sovereign?" "No," Julian said softly. "I want you to stand back and let the market teach them the lesson." He hung up and turned to Sienna. "Book me a flight to New York. Any airline, but not Sovereign." Sienna looked at him, still in disbelief at his composure. "You're not angry?" Julian smiled faintly, a smile almost cold. "Sienna, I'm not angry. I'm just collecting data." "Data?" "Yes, a rare variable, one worth analyzing to see how much market value it can wipe out in 24 hours. His tone was quiet, but the weight of it made Sienna's skin prickle. She had worked with Julian for 8 years, had seen him dismantle rivals with a single signature, shake markets with a single post, but she had never seen him this silent. And she knew, when Julian Mercer was silent, it was the most dangerous moment of all. Outside the glass, the G650 began to move down the runway, its navigation lights flickering across the snow like distant embers. Julian stood motionless, watching, his eyes reflecting that cold light. "Fascinating," he murmured. "They're taking off, yet they don't realize everything they have is about to crash." Sienna looked at him, unsure whether to fear or admire him. He kept his eyes on the departing jet, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "People think power lives in the cockpit, Sienna. But in this world, real power lives in the ones who write the story." As the sun disappeared behind the Rockies, the first traces of night began to settle over Aspen Airport. In the quiet lounge, Julian Mercer sat alone, eyes fixed on his phone screen. The clock read 7:32 p.m., right on schedule. The press release had gone live. No sensational headlines, no accusations, just words so precise and cold they cut like a scalpel. After concluding a strategic partnership signing in Aspen, Nexora Analytics CEO Julian Mercer and his assistant were asked to leave their chartered flight with Sovereign Air Charter due to a manifest discrepancy. No further explanation was provided. Nexora is currently reviewing its multi-million-dollar corporate account with Sovereign Air. Just a few lines, but enough to ignite the entire internet. The report first appeared on a tech blogger's feed, then CNBC, then across financial media outlets. Within 2 hours, the hashtag #SuchFlyingWhileBlack climbed into the top trending topics. Black CEOs, athletes, even politicians began sharing their own stories. Moments when they too were doubted simply because they didn't look like people of privilege. Meanwhile, in New York, at the headquarters of Sovereign Air Charter, Victor Langley, the company's 66-year-old CEO, was having dinner with his wife. His phone buzzed relentlessly. At first, he ignored it until the head of public relations called for the third time. "Victor," her voice trembled, "we have a serious situation. A high-profile client, Julian Mercer, was removed from a flight in Aspen. Nexora's statement is spreading like wildfire." Langley frowned, setting down his wine glass. "Mercer, Nexora. They're one of our top 5 corporate clients." "Yes, and now the entire internet is accusing us of discrimination." He stood abruptly. "Get in touch with flight security. Find Knox. I want to know exactly what happened." But Knox didn't answer. Meanwhile, the PR team scrambled into an emergency meeting, hastily drafting the kind of damage control statement every collapsing company knows too well. Sovereign Air Charter is aware of the incident on tonight's Aspen flight. We prioritize safety and procedure above all else. An internal review is underway. We apologize for the inconvenience caused to Mr. Mercer. Those last 2 words, the inconvenience, were like oil poured on a fire. Within 10 minutes, social media exploded. One prominent user wrote, "Kicked off the plane he chartered, and they call it an inconvenience? That's arrogance worth hundreds of millions." Thousands echoed the sentiment. Headlines soon labeled the crisis the $500 million bias. Julian read each post without smiling. He simply watched, the glow from his phone reflecting off a face calm and focused. Beside him, Sienna's eyes were wide, her pulse racing. "Oh my God, do you see this? It's everywhere." That hashtag, millions of shares already. "Yes," Julian said quietly, his tone steady. "But that's not the interesting part." He lifted his gaze toward the runway, where another jet's landing lights shimmered in the snow. "The interesting part begins when the market opens tomorrow morning." "You think their stock will drop?" "No," he replied softly. "I know it will." In that moment, Sienna realized, Julian wasn't seeking revenge for an insult. He was conducting a global social experiment, testing how quickly a single act of bias could bring down a billion-dollar empire. "You're not destroying them with anger," she murmured. Julian smiled faintly. "No, I'm letting them destroy themselves with their own words." Across the country, in Sovereign's headquarters, Victor Langley still hadn't realized he'd made the oldest mistake in modern crisis management. When faced with a moral failure, he chose the language of procedure. And Julian Mercer, the man he had dismissed as an unusual passenger, was now using calculated silence to turn an empty apology into a verdict written in the stock market itself. Outside, the Aspen night deepened under a blanket of snow. The Sovereign G650, now just a distant streak of light, cut through the black sky. Julian watched it, his voice low, almost a whisper meant only for the universe. Sometimes, 2 wrong words are enough to make an entire empire fall. Morning in New York opened with the metallic rhythm of the financial world, the chorus of ringing phones, the rapid tapping of keyboards, and the quickened breath of people who lived and died by numbers. But today, one name echoed louder than any stock symbol: Sovereign Air Charter. When the clock struck 9:30, the opening bell rang, an anthem of hope and beginnings for most. But for Sovereign, it sounded like an executioner's blade. On the 50th floor of their Manhattan headquarters, the Bloomberg chart flickered for only a few seconds before plunging downward. Yesterday's closing price had been $62.50. This morning, it opened at $54.20, nearly 15% wiped out in the first heartbeat. A trader shouted, "What the hell happened to Sovereign?" His colleague answered without taking his eyes off the screen. "Media. Nexora's statement. They just killed a brand with 4 sentences." In Sovereign's main boardroom, CEO Victor Langley and his senior executives sat in a tense row, the glow of the screens casting pale reflections on their faces. Outside, a curtain of early winter rain blurred the skyline, as if even the skyscrapers were bowing their heads. "How bad is it?" Langley rasped. $49.75, CFO Gerald replied, his hands trembling around an iPad, and still dropping. "That's impossible. It was just a minor incident." "Not anymore," Gerald said. "They're calling it a trust crisis. The press is asking if our pilots can arbitrarily remove a $1 million charter client. What other rot is hidden inside this company?" The communications director spoke up, her voice rising with panic. Hashtag #Sovereign problem is #1 worldwide. Celebrities, CEOs, even members of Congress are sharing it. Clients are canceling charter contracts. Refund requests are flooding in. Langley gripped the armrest of his chair. "Get me Knox. I want to hear from him directly." "He hasn't answered, sir. There's word he filed a report but went home. The report says, and I quote, passenger did not match the manifest description and posed potential security risks." Langley gave a bitter laugh, though fear flickered behind his eyes. Security risk? He called a black CEO a security risk? No one replied. Only the sound of numbers collapsing filled the room. 48, 47, 40. 5. On the 92nd floor of Nexora Tower, Julian Mercer sat before the panoramic glass wall, watching those same numbers fall in real time. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He was simply silent. Sienna entered and set a coffee beside him. "Breaking news. CNBC is calling it the Mercer effect. They're saying Sovereign stock is reacting to a lesson in ethics." Julian took a slow sip, his eyes still on the graph. "Not ethics, Sienna. Justice. Market justice. It doesn't need courts or laws. It only needs truth." Across New York, trading floors erupted in chaos. Automated algorithms, ironically powered by Nexora's own AI technology, scanned the internet for keywords like scandal, racism, and investigation, measuring public sentiment. The result? Automatic sell-offs of Sovereign shares. Within 45 minutes, the company had lost nearly $250 million in market value. Inside Sovereign's boardroom, Langley slammed his fist on the table. "Suspend trading. File for a market inquiry. Issue an official statement immediately." "We already did," the PR director said weakly. "But everyone's seen Nexora's post. It's factual. And the media's demanding the cockpit audio." Langley roared. "Then where is Knox? I want him suspended now." In a quiet house in suburban New Jersey, Captain Harold Knox sat on his sofa, staring at the financial news. His name flashed on the screen beside the words, "Captain under investigation." His face went pale. No, I was just following protocol," he muttered. His wife stood in the doorway, eyes full of fear. "What did you do, Harold?" He didn't answer. He only stared at the screen, watching sovereign stock continue to fall like a stone. And high above Manhattan, in Nexora Tower, Julian leaned back in his chair, the city's reflections dancing across the glass behind him. "You just made an airline lose hundreds of millions with 4 sentences, Sienna said quietly. "Don't you think that's a bit cold?" Julian smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. "I didn't do anything. I just held up a mirror. What they saw in it, that was their choice." Outside, rain hammered against the windows, blending with the frenzied rhythm of Wall Street. And in the storm's reflection, one truth became clear. Disrespect doesn't just cost a man his dignity. It can bring an empire to its knees. While Wall Street reeled from the market chaos, in another corner of Manhattan, inside a cluttered office filled with half-empty coffee cups and stacks of papers, Nora Patel, investigative journalist for the Financial Chronicle, was scrolling through the coverage of the sovereign scandal. Her eyes stopped on one headline. $250 million vanishes in 2 hours because of one word. She smirked. One word? There has to be an entire rotten system behind it. At 38, Nora was the kind of journalist who kept CEOs awake at night. Short black hair, sharp eyes that never blinked in the face of power. She had already taken down 3 corporate frauds, and now her instincts told her that the Mercer sovereign affair wasn't just about race. It was a window into a decaying culture of privilege. She picked up her phone and called an old contact at the Federal Aviation Administration. "Mark, I need you to check a name for me. Captain Harold Knox, Sovereign Air Charter." The voice on the other end hesitated. "It's him. The entire FAA is talking about it." "Anything in his history?" Nora asked. Mark sighed. "Officially clean, but in the internal customer feedback file, 3 unresolved complaints, all from passengers of color or Middle Eastern descent, each marked as personality conflict." 3? Nora raised an eyebrow. "And he still flies VIP charters?" "Money, Nora. And the name Knox has strong protection." She hung up, opened her laptop, and began typing rapidly. The facts clicked into place like blood-stained gears. She knew what she needed. An insider. And a name flashed in her mind, Theo Ramos, the first officer on that flight. Within minutes, she found his social media account, a young man with a clean record, once posting proudly, "Becoming a pilot means believing in fairness and open skies." Nora sent a brief message. "I know you were there. I'm not looking for blame. I'm looking for truth." 2 hours later, her phone buzzed. A reply appeared. "Meet me at the cafe near Teterboro, 9 a.m. tomorrow." Nora smiled, took a sip of cold coffee, and whispered, "The door just opened." The next morning, the small cafe near Teterboro Airport was shrouded in fog. Theo Ramos sat in a back corner, his hands clasped, eyes tired. He looked younger than 29, but his face carried the weight of guilt. Nora sat across from him, opened her notebook, and left the recorder off. "I don't want you to be afraid," she said. "I just want to hear what really happened." Theo was silent for a long time before he whispered, "I knew Mr. Mercer was the lead passenger. The manifest was clear. But when Captain Knox saw him, he changed. He said, 'There must be a mistake. The principal passenger is Sterling Wexford, not this man.' I tried to tell him no, that the data was verified, but he told me, 'Learn to trust your instincts, not paperwork.'" Nora nodded, her gaze never leaving him. "And then he told me to add a note to the logbook, manifest discrepancy, pending ID verification. I knew it was false, but he's the captain. If I objected, my career would be over." He lowered his head, voice shaking. I stayed silent when Mr. Mercer was forced off. He looked at me, not angry, just looked. That look hasn't let me sleep since. Nora jotted notes quickly, then softened her voice. "You know, silence is also a kind of statement. But now, you have a chance to make a new one. The right way." Theo lifted his head, and in his exhausted eyes, a spark flickered, pained but resolute. "I'll tell you everything. Even what I heard Knox say over the radio. He said, 'We don't let anyone on this plane whose face doesn't match the name.'" Nora closed her notebook, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Thank you, Theo. That sentence will be the headline." That night, as the city glowed beneath a web of neon lights, Nora sat at her desk, typing with the fury of someone carving words into the hull of a sinking ship. The case of Julian Mercer was not an isolated incident, but the outcome of a culture that quietly allowed suspicion to become policy. She watched the final headline appear on the screen. "Truth at altitude. First officer confirms Captain Knox fabricated security. Concerned to remove Nexora CEO from flight." She hit send to editor. In that moment, Nora knew the media war had entered phase 2. It was no longer about one flight. It was a trial for the entire system. 6:45 a.m. The first light of dawn cut through the windows of the Financial Chronicle newsroom like a blade slicing through the dark. On the editor, in Chief's monitor, Nora Patel's headline blazed in bold letters. "The $250 million lie. First officer confirms captain fabricated security reason to remove Nexora CEO from flight." The publish button was pressed, and within seconds the article spread like wildfire. Financial outlets, tech blogs, aviation forums all erupted at once. Every line Nora wrote, concise, sharp, with quotes, evidence, and witnesses, hit Sovereign Air Charter like a bullet straight to the heart. The hashtag, "The 250 million lie," flooded Twitter, LinkedIn, and Reddit. At Sovereign's headquarters, Victor Langley had barely entered his office when he saw the data storm. His secretary's voice trembled. "Sir, the article's out. They have evidence, Ramos's confession." Langley's face went pale. "Impossible. Do they have recordings?" "No, sir. But they have his own words, and FAA confirmation." He sank into his chair. On the screen before him, the company's stock chart plunged in a vertical line. In his New Jersey home, Harold Knox was having breakfast when his phone began to buzz non-stop. His name was everywhere. Veteran pilot lied to expel black CEO. FAA launches emergency investigation. First officer admits, I stayed silent because I was afraid. His coffee cup slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. He turned on the TV, only to see his own face on CNN. The anchor read aloud, Pilot Harold Knox has been suspended indefinitely following allegations that he fabricated a security concern to remove a paying black passenger from a private charter flight. His entire body shook. No, I was just following procedure. But the words dissolved into the air. Outside, news vans lined his street, cameras pointed at his front door, neighbors watching through their windows. Back at Sovereign's offices, the PR director entered, hands trembling as she handed Langley a document from the FAA. Sir, they've confirmed it. Knox had 3 prior passenger complaints, all suppressed. Now they're launching a full investigation into the company. Langley's throat tightened. 3 complaints? And we buried them? CFO Gerald lowered his head. Not just buried. We promoted him last year. The silence in the boardroom was suffocating. One executive finally muttered, The press is calling it a culture of concealment. Investors are pulling out. They're asking if our pilots can lie. How can our planes be trusted? On the screen, the Sovereign Air Charter logo flickered beneath a news ticker that read, Sovereign loses an additional $320 million in 48 hours. Major investors terminate contracts. Meanwhile, on the top floor of Nexora Tower, Julian Mercer sat by the window, the morning light reflecting across his calm face. Before him lay a printed copy of Nora Patel's article. Sienna entered, setting a cup of tea on his desk. You've read it? Yes, he said quietly. It doesn't just expose Knox. It exposes an entire system built to ignore its own rot. Sienna looked at him, a mix of admiration and unease in her eyes. They're calling you the face of a new corporate ethics revolution. But are you happy about it? Julian shook his head slowly. No, Sienna. I'm not happy when people lose their jobs or when stocks crash. But this had to happen. Because if it didn't, people like Knox would keep believing they have the right to define another person's worth by their skin or their image. He turned toward the window, gazing at a city coming alive. Nora Patel did the right thing. She'll face the media storm, but she just restored dignity for millions who never had a voice. Across town, Nora sat in the Chronicle's conference room, her phone ringing endlessly. CNN, BBC, Bloomberg all wanted interviews. The editor-in-chief beamed. You just brought down an empire with 2,000 words. Nora sipped her coffee, her eyes calm. I didn't bring it down. They did. I just turned on the light. That afternoon, an official statement from Sovereign's board was released. We accept the immediate resignation of CEO Victor Langley. Captain Harold Knox has been terminated for misconduct and fabrication of security protocol. The company is cooperating fully with the FAA and relevant authorities. Trading of Sovereign stock was suspended. Hundreds of employees were instructed to work remotely until further notice. But for the public, the verdict was already in. Sovereign was no longer the luxury name of the elite. It had become the new symbol of arrogance undone by prejudice. That night, as the evening news replayed footage of Knox lowering his head and walking past flashing cameras, Julian sat alone in his quiet office. He looked out over the night sky of New York, where hundreds of planes were still taking off. Not every flight is meant to rise, he murmured. Some are meant to fall, to clear the way for those yet to soar. 3 weeks after Nora Patel's article was published, the world had changed. No one spoke of Sovereign Air Charter with admiration anymore, only with pity or disdain. Its name had become synonymous with a $500 million lie and a culture stripped bare. In a worn suburban home in New Jersey, Harold Knox sat in his living room, the flickering light of the TV casting ghostly shadows across his ashen face. He had once been a respected captain, hailed as the face of aviation safety. Now he was an unemployed man, hunted by the press, his image plastered across every corner of the internet. The news anchor's voice filled the room. The FAA has officially revoked the flight license of former Captain Harold Knox after determining that he fabricated a security report. The act constitutes violations of sections 91.13 and 121.575 of Federal Aviation Regulations. The glass in his trembling hand slipped and shattered against the wall. His wife, who had endured years of silent arrogance, stood in the doorway and said softly, "You know, Harold, what's frightening isn't that you lost your job. It's that the world finally sees you for who you really are." She walked away and closed the door. This time, the sound was quiet, but to Knox it felt like a verdict. Days later, headlines showed his house sealed for foreclosure. Knox stood on the sidewalk holding a few boxes, his face hollow. No one cursed him. No one pitied him. Only silence. And in that silence, he finally understood. Everything he once called power had been nothing more than an illusion in the cockpit. Meanwhile, in a glass tower in Midtown, former Sovereign CEO Victor Langley sat before a federal investigative panel. He had lost everything: his position, his reputation, and even his $40 million golden parachute, cancelled for gross ethical misconduct. Witnesses later said that after the hearing, he sat alone for hours in an empty room, murmuring to himself, "We were just following procedure. We didn't mean any harm." But that very procedure had destroyed his company. 2 months later, Sovereign Air Charter was sold to a European conglomerate for barely a tenth of its pre-crisis value. The name was erased, the fleet repainted, and the proud Sovereign logo, the golden wings on black, was stripped from every aircraft under the cold whine of the wind. Online, a single comment went viral. "Any company that flies on prejudice will always land in disaster." At the same time, Theo Ramos, the first officer who had once stayed silent, became a public flashpoint. He lost his job and was temporarily barred from flying. But unlike Knox, he didn't hide. He sat down for an interview with Nora Patel, his voice unsteady. "I was wrong. Not because I lied, but because I didn't speak the truth. But if my confession can stop someone else from doing the same, then I'll repeat it every day." His words spread everywhere. They called him the silent pilot who found his voice. Across the city, in the 90th-floor office of Nexora Tower, Julian Mercer quietly watched it all unfold. There were no lawsuits, no claims for compensation. He released only one statement: "We are not seeking revenge. We are seeking change." A month later, he announced the Horizon Initiative, a $50 million non-profit funded by Nexora to train pilots and aviation staff from underrepresented communities, along with the Integrity Flight program, an international ethics and equity curriculum for the aviation industry. At the launch event, he told reporters. "A plane cannot fly if it isn't balanced within. Aviation is no different. Fairness isn't a slogan, it's real weight on the wings." At the back of the hall, Theo Ramos sat quietly. He had been invited as the program's first speaker. His voice trembled but held firm. "I used to think courage meant flying through storms. Now I know true courage is saying no to what's wrong, even when the storm is inside you." Nora Patel was there too, writing the final lines of her follow-up story, The Sky After the Fall. When she looked up, she saw Julian Mercer shaking hands with Theo under the lights, one man who had been silenced, and one who had once been silenced, and she knew that was the image history would remember. That night, as the city glowed beneath the horizon, Julian stood by his office window, staring into the open sky. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "Sometimes, to teach humanity how to fly higher, you first have to let a few fall." 6 months later, over the skies of New York, the morning light washed across the glass towers, reflecting off the new Nexora Tower, now a symbol of a different era, cleaner, brighter, and fairer. On the 90th floor, Julian Mercer sat quietly before the wide window, where the horizon stretched endlessly into blue. Everything seemed at peace, yet he knew true justice was never found in noise. It lived in what remained once the silence had settled. The office door opened. Sienna Park, now executive vice president, stepped in carrying a thick folder. "The specifications for the new Gulfstream G700 just arrived," she said with a spark of excitement. "They're asking where you want the logo placed, and if you'd like an inscription." Julian smiled. "Just the Nexora logo. Simple. And near the main door, a small line of text, the standard." Sienna raised an eyebrow. "Short but powerful. What does it mean?" He turned to her, his eyes calm but resolute. "It's not a slogan, it's a reminder. In this world, people think respect is a reward. But to me, it's a baseline requirement. That's the standard, Sienna. Nothing more. Nothing less." She nodded, understanding. Julian turned back toward the glass, watching the small jets taking off from Teterboro. The sky was the same, only the people beneath it were changing. Since the fall of Sovereign, 3 other charter companies had joined the Horizon Initiative, adopting Nexora's Integrity Flight training program for all their crews. Hundreds of graduates had already taken flight in new uniforms, bearing a white wing on a silver field, the emblem of equality and integrity. "Mr. Mercer," the receptionist's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Theo Ramos has arrived." Julian nodded. "Send him in." The door opened. Theo entered, thinner than before, but his eyes told a different story. No longer heavy with guilt or fear, now they held a quiet peace, the kind that comes when a man faces his own mistakes and moves beyond them. "Good to see you again, Theo," Julian said, shaking his hand with both of his. "Thank you for giving me another chance," Theo replied. "The lecture at the Florida Aviation Academy just finished. 200 students, and at least one said they chose to become a pilot because they heard our story." Julian smiled softly. "Our story, that's right. Because you didn't hide. I just happened to be there to witness it." They sat down, not as strangers across a divide, but as companions who had survived the same storm. "You know," Julian said gently, "that day when I was ordered off the plane, I thought maybe prejudice was something that could never be erased. But then I realized it doesn't need to be erased. It just needs to be seen. Once light shines on it, it disappears on its own. Theo nodded, his eyes misting. I used to fear that light. Now I know it's the only thing that keeps me flying. A long, meaningful silence filled the room. Outside, a jet lifted off, trailing a white ribbon of vapor across the clear blue. Julian rose, watching it ascend, sunlight glinting across his face like a faint halo. People still ask me why I named the G700 the Standard, he said quietly. I tell them, because some things don't need to be exceptional to be remembered. They just need to be right. And to stay right, even when standing alone. The door opened again. Nora Patel stepped in, a small recorder in hand. Apologies for dropping by unannounced, she said with a half-warm, half-knowing smile. I'm writing the follow-up to The Sky After the Fall. This time, it's about how one man turned humiliation into a new standard for an industry. Julian chuckled. If you do, make sure you write this. Justice doesn't fall from the sky, Nora. It has to be flown by human hands. Nora smiled as she jotted it down. And you're the one piloting that plane. Julian shook his head. No, I'm just reminding the world that the sky doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to those brave enough to fly, with their conscience as their compass. Outside, sunlight gleamed on the freshly painted G700, the Nexora logo shining near the door. Beneath it, the small inscription caught the wind. The Standard. The jet began to taxi, its engines rumbling with a deep, steady power. As it lifted off the runway, the reflection of light off its silver body made the entire sky shimmer. Sienna watched from the window and asked softly, "Do you think they'll understand the message?" Julian's eyes stayed on the jet climbing higher. They don't have to understand it. They just have to feel it. Because true respect doesn't need to be explained. A quiet pause followed. Then his voice dropped, rich with meaning. We can't control how others see us, but we can control how firmly we stand when they see us wrong. The plane soared upward, cutting through the clouds, leaving a long white trail. A signature of justice written across the sky. A new chapter began, not through vengeance, but through the quiet, steady standard of dignity. The sky remains the same, vast, deep and blue. But the way we fly through it has changed. The story of Julian Mercer is not just about a man who was misjudged, but a reminder to us all that dignity needs no permission to take flight. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with noise or verdicts, but in a single moment of silence when a person chooses to stand tall instead of bow down. And that silence, when illuminated by wisdom, resolve, and faith, can make even an empire stop and look at itself. If this story made you believe that respect is not a privilege, but a standard, leave a like to share that message. Share this video to remind someone that fairness doesn't need to shout, it only needs to exist, steady and true, like the straight path of a plane through a storm. And if you believe that there are still people in this world who choose to do what is right, even when no one is watching, subscribe to join us, where stories of justice, dignity, and courage continue to be written, one flight at a time.